welcome to the latest edition of the Pro Football Focus IDP podcast, The Nickel. I am your host, Walton Spurlin, and as we head into the fantasy football playoffs, I am once again honored and happy to be joined by one of the brightest and best minds in all the IDP land, a man whose IDP waiver wire article you want to read every Tuesday at Pro Football Focus, Mr. Ross Miles.
Thank you very much, Wally. It's great to speak to you again. And yeah, it's definitely time now. It's playoff time in fantasy football land, and I'm excited. I've got a few leagues I'm going to try and shake things up in. I'm not sure if I'm going to win anything this year, but it's always nice to be in with a shout.
Oh, exactly. And hopefully we've got plenty of listeners still that perhaps have been with us all year and used some of our advice to make it this far and are continuing on with us. And maybe even some folks that didn't make the playoffs but are just used to the weekly visit with Ross and Wally. So we've got a lot to talk about. Again, it's playoff time, so we will waste no time in getting right to it. And let's start with our news, notes, injuries. And boy, there were a couple of significant ones last night, Ross, in that we were just talking before the show a little bit. I call it a foul fest football game. And let's start with what looked to be the more significant one, although we don't like to call any injuries minor, but linebacker Ryan Shazier, ironically on one of the only plays that didn't really involve a cheap shot or a suspension, just making a tackle, head in a bad position, and he was taken off on a cart. And what's the latest we know about that, Ross?
Yeah, he's been diagnosed with a spinal contusion, and we're not quite sure what his return is going to be. From all reports, the swelling on his spinal cord has been going down. I read a report just before we came on air from GM Kevin Colbert. He said that he's not going to need any surgery and he's continuing to improve. He has had some movement in his legs, so all that stuff is sounding good. Where we just really don't know if he's going to be back on the field this year at all. We're just wishing him the best right now.
Exactly. This is a case where, obviously we love football, we love fantasy football, we love IDP fantasy football, but first and foremost, it's about the health of a young man that, if he plays again is really neither here nor there right now. We just want him to be okay, and so we'll keep sending positive thoughts that way. And another linebacker of note, Vontaze Burfict, was also placed on a backboard and carted off of the field with a head injury. Now this one I haven't been able to find out too much information on, where, as you mentioned, there's been some updates on Shazier. As of our recording this, I haven't been able to hear much more about Burfict, but that's another big blow to not only the Cincinnati defense, but to the IDP landscape.
Certainly is. I mean, Burfict was a player who was suspended for the first 3 games of the year, I believe. It might have been 4. So if you have Burfict and you drafted him, even you were really counting on him paying dividends at this time of the year for you. So like you say, Wally, we're still waiting for clarity on the situation. We haven't had any further updates. Obviously, Monday night game, but I think you've got to count on Burfict not playing for the time being.
Exactly, and I'm sure we'll delve into this a little bit more on the waiver wire as far as possible replacements and things for some of these injured players. And it looks like your Rams may have dodged a bullet as another top linebacker for IDP purposes, Alec Ogletree. He was, I believe, diagnosed with a hyperextended elbow and was, I believe, unable to return to the game. And he was having a nice day.
He was. It was early in the game. I think it was first quarter when he got the injury, and like you said, he didn't return. But thankfully for his owners, myself included, he did actually record a pick 6. So he kind of bailed you out if you plugged him in, despite the fact he only saw the field for a small portion of the game. I believe he is considered questionable for this week. We'll wait and see. Other people have reported day to day, but I think most fantasy sites have him as questionable. So we'll just have to wait and see. But this one is one I think that we will see him on the field for. Obviously, it's a big game against the Eagles.
Right. Yeah. Another big game for your Rams. They're playing well, so they definitely could use Ogletree on the field. And speaking of getting back on the field, the Houston Texans have activated inside linebacker Brian Cushing from the reserve suspended list. So we may be seeing Brian Cushing back on the field here coming up in Week 14.
Yeah, potentially. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Obviously, Cushing's the veteran in that linebacking core, but they have a couple of quite interesting young guys in Bernardrick McKinney and rookie Zach Cunningham. So whether they're going to want to keep Cunningham out there, we're going to have to wait and see. Keep an eye on what practice reports are saying if you can see anything in from the local beat reporters. But yeah, we'll see. I think Cushing. I've liked Cushing in the past, but he hasn't quite delivered. Perhaps they might leave Cunningham in.
Right, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out because they have a very nice matchup this week against the 49ers. I think we can plan on McKinney being in there, and then it'll just see if Cunningham starts to come off in favor of Cushing. And speaking of coming off the field, Browns rookie safety Jabril Peppers, who probably all in all is having a bit of an underwhelming season, but he was undergoing an MRI on Monday. Do we have any information there, Ross?
I believe Coach Hugh Jackson thinks it's not too serious. Hopefully he's going to play. So we'll have to again keep an eye on what's being said in the media. Keep an eye on the beat reports. But Peppers for me has been a little bit underwhelming this year. He has been an every down player, but he hasn't really produced the fantasy output we were hoping for. I know in particular we were quite keen based on the scheme he was in the preseason. So I hope he gets back. But he has let people down. He's probably riding a few benches by now in fantasy teams.
Right, and another player that is being listed as week to week that may not be available for the fantasy playoffs, or at least the beginning of them, is Bills defensive end Shaq Lawson.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this one despite the fact that Lawson's not been having the greatest of seasons because it's an excellent matchup. I really wanted to list him as a potential waiver wire grab this week, but I'm concerned. After I got it a little bit wrong last week with Flowers and Smith, who both missed. So I didn't want to get too heavily involved in Shaq Lawson. So do keep an eye on him. If he gets on the field, I think it could be a good matchup for him.
Right, and speaking of being on the field, looks like Tre'Davious White, his teammate, rookie cornerback, having a nice season. He's now in the concussion protocol, and I'll tell you, I believe Rob Gronkowski deserved the one-game suspension he got for that because, again, as we've talked about in the past with some of the plays that we've seen, I don't see a place for that in the game right now. And speak a little bit, if you would, how you feel about the suspension for Gronkowski and the play overall that injured White.
Yeah, it was a weird hit. I mean, Gronkowski was clearly out of order. I mean, I have to assume he'd been touched down. It was a bit of a frustration play. But yeah, again, like you, I'm happy for the letter of the law to stand here. Gronkowski deserves his suspension. It's quite frustrating for cornerback required gamers who where White had been very valuable. I own him in a few leagues, and I'd been cashing in on him, so quite disappointing.
Right, yeah, the Bills. It's a couple of youngsters. If they're out without Lawson and White, two guys they can ill afford to lose, and like I said, that also has fantasy ramifications, and some big ramifications could be coming out of Dallas. As it looks like Sean Lee, who's missed, I believe, the last basically 4 games, because I believe he played 8 snaps the week that he hurt his hamstring, looks like he's on schedule to return in Week 14, and that's going to shake things up, I believe, in the Dallas linebacking core.
Yeah, it certainly should. I mean, again, another player I was kind of looking at as being a potential waiver wire grab would have been Anthony Hitchens, but with Lee expected back in the fold, I think he may not lose all his playing time, but he could lose definitely some of the tackles. Jalen Smith's another guy who's been playing in Lee's absence, but yeah, Lee has been circa an elite fantasy linebacker when on the field. So if he's back, and it sounds like he is, he's feeling good, said Jerry Jones. So yeah, you've got to play him, I think, this week.
I agree completely, and I probably missed the boat last week in a league where just a similar situation, so people can get an idea. Danny Trevathan returned, and I always kind of think, well, maybe they're going to ease him back into action. Well, that doesn't seem to be the way teams are thinking these days. It's like maybe they're kept Lee out for one more week to make sure he's good to go. Maybe that's what they do with Trevathan. So I agree with Ross. You just have to look at it like if Lee is active on Sunday, he's going to be playing a full complement of snaps. So, get him in your lineup, just as Ross suggested. And somebody who is uncertain or not if he'll be in the lineup, we'll finish off the injury report by talking about Telvin Smith, who right now is still in the concussion protocol.
He is. Yeah, I thought this was one we were going to get him on the field, but we've seen a few players in recent recent weeks and recent seasons, stay out for multiple weeks with concussions. So this is definitely one to be wary of. You're going to want to keep again monitoring the beat news reporters and see what's being said. But Paul Posluszny is the person who stepped in to replace him, as we thought he probably would, if this was the case, and he's been productive. So I'm sure we'll talk more about him when we get down to the waiver wire and top performers.
Oh yeah, I look forward to talking a little bit of Paz. We touched on him last week a little bit, and I think as you said, we'll touch on him in the waiver wires. And now let's move on to some top performers from the defensive line position last week. And again, as we've talked about, it's names of note: Joey Bosa, Aaron Donald. I know that brings a smile to Ross's face, and DeMarcus Lawrence. Talk a little bit about that terrific trio and what they were able to do last week.
Yeah, some impressive performances from all three of those guys. I mean, Joey Bosa ranks in the top 5 now of the league for tackles, sacks, and forced fumbles with 54, 11.5, and 4 respectively. Another great week last week. 7 total tackles, a sack, and a forced fumble. He keeps putting the pressure on, and this is what we've expected from him ever since we've seen him get in the league as a rookie. So long may it continue. DeMarcus Lawrence again, he finally roared back into action. We briefly touched on whether he was someone you want to bench or think twice about starting, because he'd had 2 blanks in the sack column, but no 2 sacks last week. He continues to lead the league in sacks now with 13.5. So keep him in your lineups every single week. And Aaron Donald, after again a slow start, possibly hampered by his contract issues, just 1 sack in the first 5 games. He's had 7 sacks in the last 7 games, including 2 last week. So Donald's on a bit of a tear as well.
Exactly. As we kept touching on when the holdout was going on, that they could ill afford to not have him on the field, and he's just proving that point for us with the performances he keeps putting up on a weekly basis. And the final name we're going to touch on is somebody who I'm pretty sure this is the first time that we've mentioned Kenny Clark of the Green Bay Packers.
It is. It's just, I think, top performers, this little section of the podcast isn't necessarily about talking about fantasy relevant people. This is an opportunity to talk about people that deserve the shout out for being some of the best players on the field last week. And when a big 3-4 nose tackle gets 2 sacks and a forced fumble in a single game, I think we need to give that man some props. So Kenny Clark, we're loving it.
There it is. Yes, it's we like to give some love to the big uglies as they're affectionately called sometimes. And I'll tell you, that whole Green Bay defense stepped up last week. I think they had 7 total sacks, and Clay Matthews finally had a good game with like 2.5. That just stood out to me, just because it's not been that kind of year for Clay. But anytime I get to mention Clay Matthews, it's my wife's favorite player. So I promised her I'd give him a shout out this week because she thinks I've been giving him too much grief. But let's move on to the waiver wire. A couple of interesting names here, and we're going to stay in Green Bay for the first one.
Yeah, I think they obviously listened to the podcast, Wally. They heard us ragging on them, and they're like, right, the PFF IDP boys are giving us a hard time. Has put up some numbers, and yeah, Mike Daniels continues to put up numbers. In the last 4 games, 2.5 sacks and 19 total tackles. He's not a high ceiling guy. He's not going to start going crazy and score these kind of multi-sack games. He's just going to plod away. But he's got a high floor. He's in a decent matchup this week. If you need someone, I think Mike Daniels could do a job for you. And the second guy I like, again, it's tough this time of year on the waiver wire. I spent a long time trying to work out which was my angle going to be this week, and I've just gone with, just in a bit of a rich vein of form, 3 sacks in the last 2 weeks for Danico Autry of the Oakland Raiders. He's playing over 60% of snaps in the last 3 of the last 4 games. Yeah, if you're in a deeper league and you're really scrambling, this guy potentially could put up a performance for you.
Right, and I concur about the defensive line position as I'm getting ready to do my start-sit article. I'm doing a lot of research, looking, but this is a tough week. There's a lot of not great matchups. If trends continue and offensive lines that have been protecting the quarterback well do so, some big name guys, we might have to temper our expectations and things. I'm sure we'll get to that in the matchups part. And one last quick little side note on Mike Daniels is that TJ Lang, former offensive lineman for the Packers that plays for the Lions now, does a weekly segment on local radio. And one of the questions he was asked is, who is the strongest football player he's ever played with? And he didn't hesitate to say that it was Mike Daniels. And he also said he's one of the angriest. So that's what you kind of want from your defensive lineman, and especially picking somebody up on the waiver wire late in the year. And again, folks, make sure you read Ross's article. It's all the stuff you need to know to be the first ones on your waiver wire to get in front of the curve, as we often talk about. And now we're gonna talk about the linebackers. And again, we might as well start with the man that we've touched on, and someone who for years has been an IDP standout that looked like he was being eased out of the picture in Jacksonville, and due to injury, we got to see a little super pause.
We did. Obviously, I said last week he's a guy I wasn't going to be picking up, and I thought we were going to see Smith back on the field. Being proved wrong. We can't tell how long Smith is going to be out. Missing multiple weeks with concussion doesn't. I think you've got to go and grab Pozlajny if he's out there on the waiver wire. He racked up 14 total tackles and 1.5 sacks in replacement duty last week. That's the kind of line Talvin Smith himself had been posting. Clearly there's production to be had there, and Poz has just about enough in the tank to rack up decent points for you. So I'm expecting more big performances if he's on the field.
Right, and speaking of big performances, Anthony Hitchens, he really stepped up. I did not see this coming. He's been serviceable in place of Sean Lee being injured, and boy, against the Washington Redskins, he was much more than serviceable.
Yeah, 15 total tackles. Geez, that was like you say, a big performance. Potentially didn't see it coming. I mean, this was only his second double-digit tackle game of the season. So on that basis, I'm not sure how many people would have started him. Again, we're gonna have to. I think he's still going to retain value because even with Lee in the lineup, he's still going to be on the field. But yeah, I'm not sure if we'll see a double-digit tackle again from him for the rest of the season, maybe.
Right, that's an excellent point. In that I was kind of going back and researching again for articles, whatever. Due to injuries, really, Sean Lee and Anthony Hitchens, you got to remember Hitchens started the season missing the first 4 games with a knee issue, and then Pozlajny missed a couple of games, came back. They've only played together in 2 games where Pozlajny played over 90% of the snaps, and in those 2 games combined, Anthony Hitchens only played 54 snaps. Now, again, that was in weeks, I believe, 8 and 9. So, things have changed somewhat, and I believe that they will find a way to keep Hitchens on the field more. But I think, with Lee back in the lineup, we may really want to temper expectations for Hitchens. And, boy, we don't want to temper expectations for this next guy. Because to me, as I say every time we talk about him, to me, he came out of nowhere. I don't believe we touched on him in the preseason. But Joe Schobert just keeps getting it done.
Yeah, wow. 12 total tackles, a sack and a forced fumble last week. This guy really has continued to get it done. He's actually had 10 or more total tackles in 7 of his last 9 appearances. So, yeah, if you're someone who got on the Joe Schobert train early, hopefully you've ridden it all the way because he has extremely valuable.
Oh, he definitely has. And there's a point early in the season where in my article, I would list Joe Schobert as a start because he's putting up good numbers. Well, that got to be redundant because I could just put him in there every week because he's a weekly start. You just plug him in there and you don't worry about it, and you just expect double-digit tackles. And speaking of that, Christian Jones, another big week for the Bears, even with the return of Danny Trevathan. Christian Jones got it done.
He did. Again, this is another player who's been pretty productive. We caught onto him on the waiver wire as well, thankfully. 13 total tackles and a sack last week. He's actually had 7 or more total tackles in 7 of his last 8 games. Pitched in a couple of big plays in recent weeks, a couple of sacks in his last 3 games. So Christian Jones, if he's out there on the waiver wire and you're hurting because of these recent injuries to Burfict and Shazier and the like, Ogletree, Smith, consider Jones as well. He's worth looking at if he's still there.
Right, yeah, it's taken him a bit, like you said, now with the big play production to go along with the tackle production. Even with Trevathan back in the line, but he was still getting it done. And of course, his next player is just, I guess all I can say is keeps getting it done as well, because that's old reliable Bobby Wagner with another big week.
Yep, 13 total tackles. He's 113 total tackles in the season now, so he's smashed through the 100 barrier with plenty of games to go. Yeah, he's only 4 off the league lead, Zach Brown. So yeah, another great season for Wagner, who I believe, as we mentioned last week, could well be in the running for Defensive Player of the Year.
Yep, we've touched on that now. Speaking of defensive player of the league of the year, it looks like he might be maybe planting his flag a little bit deeper by just continuing to get it done. Now we'll move on to the waiver wire, and again we've touched on Paul Posluszny quite a bit. But if anything else to add there, Ross?
Yeah, obviously after missing last week on some of the injury issues, I think it's a lot clearer the situation with Shazier and in particular where we are pretty confident he's going to be out for at least a week or two while we wait and see what happens there. Obviously, the reports were that Tommy Maddox had previously had a similar injury and only missed 1 week, so hopefully I'm not making light of a more serious situation. But in the meantime, take a look at Tyler Matakatevich. He played 41 of 64 snaps on Monday Night Football following Shazier leaving the field. He managed to post 7 total tackles in the meantime, so he's going to be the direct replacement. I think obviously Vince Williams probably gains a little bit of value as well, but if you there's potential he's already owned. So if you need to dig a bit deeper, Matakatevich.
Yeah, I like Williams. I like that suggestion. I like Matakevich as well. The thing we got to keep in mind here, though, is that he also ended up leaving that game late with a shoulder issue and ended up not finishing the game. Again, prior to recording, I was scouring the web looking for any updates on Matakevich. Couldn't find one. But yeah, watching the game, he stepped right in and really, and played well. And he was out there on passing downs. So let's hope that this shoulder injury to him isn't too bad because and I, as Ross said, I would still advise picking him up. I mean, worst case scenario, we find out that he's not going to go. Well, then we've offered up some other linebackers that could perhaps help, but it looks right now like, yeah, he is the handcuff, if you will, which is rare in IDP side. But to Shazier, again, just monitor practice reports out of Pittsburgh and make sure he gets back on the, he gets back in the rotation. And then if he does, I like that kid as a waiver wire pickup, as Ross had suggested. And now let's move on to the defensive backs. Again, some familiar names and a few that maybe aren't as familiar, especially the first name, cornerback who really stepped up for the Dolphins.
Yeah, Xavier Howard with 2 interceptions last week, one of them a pick 6. He hadn't been fantasy relevant all year. This was his first splash plays of the year, but he's probably going to top most of your league's defensive back scoring last week thanks to those interceptions and the pick 6. So, yeah, I don't recommend picking him up, but yeah, props to the guy.
Right, exactly. Have a big game. Let's give the shout out. But yeah, as Ross said, it's not really advisable to chase those splash plays. We go back to, was it Kevin Byard that was tearing it up for like 3 weeks in a row. Well, it hasn't been quite the same since then. You'll see his name if all you do is look at the yearly, fantasy numbers. You'll say, look at that Kevin Byard. He's still having a great year, but it's kind of tailed off. And it's kind of the same with Howard. Don't just go by that Week 13 stat line when you're looking at the waiver wire because it was big plays and chasing those is not advisable, especially at this crucial time of year. And it was nice to see this veteran. Unfortunately, it wasn't nice to see the team he did it against, my Lions. But Eric Weddle, again, who's kind of become a big play, to me, kind of a big play dependent type player. Not the tackle numbers he had in his youth, but nice game from Weddle.
Yeah, it certainly was. Weddle had a sack, had a forced fumble, and a pick 6 in the game. So he was certainly making plays. But yeah, as you kind of hinted at, and he had 3 total tackles. That marked what's been kind of a trend all year for him. I think only in 2 games this year he had more than 5 total tackles, and that's really hampered his fantasy value. He's a player we used to depend on at the top of the defensive back rankings because of his high tackle floor, and he really hasn't shown that this season. And so I think this could be the final season when Eric Weddle is a real fantasy factor defensive back.
All right, and this next name, Micah Hyde, finally got through and posted his first double-digit tackle game of the year.
Yeah, Hyde racked up 12 total tackles. He's kind of been a guy we've been looking at a little bit on the fringes of fantasy value. He's been flirting to score more, had a couple of good matchups, obviously the favourable home stat crew. So it's nice to see he's finally reaped the rewards with 12 total tackles in a single game. But again, I'm not sure I'm going to be aggressively pursuing him on the waiver wire if he's about. And if you're an owner of him, I think it's debatable whether he would have been in your starting lineup.
Right, and somebody who I'm sure has been in the starting lineups and some folks were probably a little bit worried about after Week 12, stepped right back up last week, and that's Budda Baker of the Arizona Cardinals.
He did, yeah, 9 total tackles. It was important for him to sort of get back on the straight and narrow after a poor week in week 12 when he had 4 total tackles. Obviously, huge debut, proper start when he got 30 plus points, I believe, in his first game. So the fact that we talked him up a lot and said he was a shoe-in to be a DB1, and then disappointed with just 4 total tackles. Yeah, I was glad to see he had 9 last week. So yeah, I'm still happy to keep him right up there as a DB1.
Right. Trust me, I had quite a few interesting tweets sent my way after suggesting Baker as a start in my week 12 start sit article. I still stand by it. As I said, it was a down game. That happens, but we look at what he did last week, see that he's still getting the snaps. He's still getting it done. So, one down week does not a lost season make or lost end of the season for you. Is I think Baker's somebody that a lot of IDP owners are going to be able to ride into the playoffs, and he's going to give you more of these performances than the down one in week 12. And now the next couple of players we'll talk about, we kind of segue right in from top performers and right into the waiver wire. And it's a couple of safeties that have really stepped up for their teams of late. Go ahead and talk a little bit about Justin Simmons and Bradley McDougald.
Yeah, I'll touch on McDougald first, mainly because he's a player I feel we kind of sat on the fence a little bit about over the last few weeks. I mean, we've known there's been issues with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. He's now come in full time to replace Chancellor, who's on IR. In fact, he's been an every down player since week 9. And over these last 2 weeks, he's really had a couple of good games. He's actually had 21 total tackles, 14 of which were solo. So I think, rather than stepping away from McDougald, I think, we might have to embrace him for these final few games of the year. Those last 2 performances have caught my eye, and I think that, at this time of year, I think the waiver wire is quite bare. So someone that's going to score, that's averaged over 10 total tackles in each of the last 2 games, that's someone you want to get involved with. And as for Justin Simmons, again, he's someone we've been trying to keep an eye on what exactly was going to happen in the Broncos' backfield after they let TJ Ward go. But yeah, Simmons is the one that's really progressed in the recent weeks. In the last month, he's had 27 total tackles, a sack, and a pick 6. It's not bad. He hasn't. He's really turned it on a little bit more recently, but he's shown a level of consistency that you can't really sniff at. He's had more than 5 tackles in 10 of 12 games this season. So I think Simmons again is someone. If he's on the waiver wire and you're needing someone, I wouldn't say no either.
Right, that's a great point, and it's like Simmons he's improved as the season's gone on, which is probably what you expect from a young player. Stepping into the shoes once filled by T.J. Ward, but now you're a starting safety, an every down player. I'm sure there was a bit of a learning curve, and as Ross has pointed out, he's picking it up. Now he's given the performances that can help us, and he's very likely still on your waiver wire because people may have stopped looking his way, but not the sharp eye of Ross Miles, who finds you the guys that you need, and right on the money with McDougald. Like I said, I particularly was waffling a bit, but you can look back at some of the performance he put up when he played at Tampa. His role got diminished there. He really had a diminished role early on, but with all the injuries in Seattle, they're calling on the veteran, and as Ross astutely pointed out, the veteran has stepped up. And now we get to move on to, I think, the most important part heading into the playoffs, the matchups that Ross likes. We've talked about the waiver wire guys to help your teams. Now we're going to talk about some of the positive and negative matchups that could really impact your chances to win or lose as we head into the fantasy playoffs. Let's start with some edge rushers that have positive matchups, and this is good to see. This is a name I like, especially after the 49ers the defensive linemen last week were held without a sack against the Bears. That could change this week in a matchup with the Houston Texans.
Yeah, it could. I mean, the Houston Texans have been one of the best, if not the best, matchup for defensive linemen in fantasy football. So, again, and the problem here is it's a 3-4 scheme, and we're talking edge rushers. So, again, Solomon Thomas, I guess, is the name I'm going to throw out. I know DeForest Buckner comes from the inside. He potentially could have a better day as well. It's a shame that such a juicy matchup has fallen on potentially the wrong kind of defense in the first week of the fantasy playoffs.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to be honest here. I have Thomas in one of my long-running IDP leagues where we play for some toothpicks, as they say, and I could use a big game from Thomas after last week, which I knew was a hard matchup. The Bears aren't that great for defensive linemen, but I like this matchup, especially in week 1 of the playoffs. And another matchup we like, and boy, you like most defenders against this really struggling Denver Broncos offense, but there's a couple of New York Jets that could be in for big days.
Certainly will be. Mohammed Wilkerson and Leonard Williams are the two we want to clue in on. Obviously, they're the most productive pass rushers on in that unit. Wilkerson himself has flirted with DR1 value before, so this could be one of his bigger weeks this season, I'd imagine.
Right, and a quick side note on Wilkerson. He was one of two players disciplined by the Jets prior to last week. I know that I think he was late maybe for a team meeting, and they forced him to sit out almost the whole first quarter, I believe, or at least a couple of series. And of course, on a side note, why you need to keep an eye on the inactives every Sunday is Darren Lee was actually a healthy scratch because I believe he was late to a film session. So they brought the hammer down on the young linebacker. Kind of gave a wrist slap to Wilkerson, but I think something to look forward to. He should be back to a full complement of snaps. And as Ross has said, he's got a very juicy matchup against the Denver Broncos. And on the flip side of that, there's a Denver Bronco that we like that is a familiar name to IDP owners.
Yep, Von Miller. That guy is a productive linebacker. Unfortunately, I had to say linebacker, but he does qualify as an edge rusher. So, yeah, this is a great matchup. I'm expecting plenty of quarterback action in this game. Both of them are going to be seeing some dirt with some big men on top of them, and yeah, Von Miller is probably going to get his name on the sack sheet.
Right, and I'm sure there's a lot of fantasy owners that are waiting for a big week from Von Miller. And now we can look at a negative matchup. And Cameron Hayward, you probably, again, this is a name you may not bench depending on how many defensive linemen you start. But the Baltimore Ravens are coming to town, and they haven't exactly been a positive matchup for defensive linemen.
No, they haven't. Yeah, I think Hayward is a guy you want to be careful of this week. Again, the matchup isn't great, so yeah, like you say, Wally, he's not someone you necessarily want to bench, but depending on how important the matchup is, your matchup are you the number one seed? Are you the number 6 seed? How are you sitting in this matchup? Will have a bearing on how you want to play this one, but be wary of this matchup.
Right, Ross makes an excellent point there. Where a lot of times this time of year it depends on your matchup, and perhaps you just look at your opponent and you think you need to swing for the fences. Then you may want to look elsewhere from Hayward because in a down matchup like this probably the last thing fantasy owners want to hear from us, Ross, is, well, temper your expectations. It's the playoffs. I think we all want high expectations. So when faced with a temper your expectations, as Ross has mentioned with this tough matchup for Hayward, there may be some of the like those 49ers we mentioned that maybe you've been starting Hayward over. Go ahead, take that swing for the fences if you think that maybe your team might be a bit outmatched. And speaking of being outmatched, it looks like Julius Peppers, who discovered a bit of the fountain of youth, and his teammate Mario Addison this week, they face off against a very tough Minnesota offense when it comes to giving up points to the defensive line.
Yeah, this is a tough one to hear. I think if you're an owner of Julius Peppers or Mario Addison, both of them have 8.5 sacks on the season, and are kind of those fringe fantasy players that you expect a big week from them every now and then. If you're starting them, you're probably really struggling for depth behind them. So having a really tough matchup against Minnesota is definitely the news I wanted to have to give you, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Well, sometimes you just got to be a straight shooter, so we let the folks know what they need to know to set those lineups. And when you're setting your lineup, a name that you may want to leave out of it, and of course we'll still wait for more injury updates on this player, but Trey Flowers, the Patriots' best pass rusher, struggling with rib issues and has a bad matchup this week with the Dolphins.
Yeah, again, well, we were hoping to play last week in a good matchup. Didn't make any time on the field. Dietrich Wise and Eric Lee were the two players that got on the field for New England. And if Flowers is out, those two will be the expected pass rushers again with the majority of the snaps. But I don't feel either are fantasy relevant at this time. We talked maybe a little bit about Wise earlier in the season as someone you might want to grab in Dynasty, and you could potentially say the same about Lee. But yeah, this isn't the place to start either of them.
Yeah, it's a real kind of confusing situation with the pass rushing for the Patriots, but as well as even at the linebacker position, because we touched on Lee a little bit last week. I just threw his name out there because he kind of stood out once Flowers went out. It's just too bad he's being listed as an outside linebacker on so many sites, because what did he end up with last week? 4 total tackles, 1.5 sacks, and an interception. Now, that's kind of an outlier week, but hey, the kid's getting it done. And he played 57 snaps. And then I was encouraged when I saw that Cal Van Noy was going to play. I'm like, okay, now here we go. At least we have some clarification there. Well, then it turns out that Van Noy only played 15 snaps. So if folks bought full into that, probably a little bit disappointed. But now let's talk about some off-ball linebackers that will not disappoint this week and have positive matchups. And we touched on the consistent tackle machine, Bobby Wagner, and he's got a teammate that's probably in for a big week as well.
Yeah, well, Wagner and KJ Wright have landed the money shot here. They've got Jacksonville here. So if you own either of these guys, you are plugging them in and you are playing them. This has been the number one matchup for most of the season for linebackers. So yeah, joy to you.
Yeah, there it is. I say you're probably always playing Wagner, but keep Wright in mind this week. And we touched on both of these linebackers a little bit earlier. Again, we'll want to keep an eye on one of them on the injury report, but the Pittsburgh Steelers have a nice matchup with the Baltimore Ravens coming to town, another divisional slugfest.
Yeah, exactly. Vince Williams and Tyler Matakevich are the guys to look out for. Again, this is the Ravens versus the Steelers. This is going to be a smash fest. They're probably going to try and pound it down each other's throats. So yeah, I'm expecting a decent game from both those guys as long as they're on the field.
Right, and this next player is, of course, Ross's favorite ex-Chicago Bear, who Ross wishes was still in Chicago, but he's not, and that's Mr. John Bostic, who has, really resurrected a career that, honestly, Ross, I thought was over.
Yeah, certainly. Bostic has been so much better since he went to Indianapolis. And yeah, he's landed a plum matchup at a crucial time for fantasy owners against Buffalo. So it'll be interesting to see how he scores. I think, potentially double digits. He's been that kind of player this year who can get that high in the right matchups.
Right, and now I'm going to go off script here for a second and throw in one name that I really like, and maybe a name that we touched on. But Benardrick McKinney of the Texans, and maybe even Brian Cushing or Zach Cunningham, whoever gets the start next to him, they go up against the 49ers team. And we touched on Christian Jones earlier, but last week the 49ers gave up double-digit tackles to both Danny Trevathan and Christian Jones. So if they stay to script and run the ball like they have been, there's going to be plenty of tackle opportunities. So I'm dipping my toe into the waiver wire part here, and I'm saying for sure go with McKinney. And now let's move on to some negative matchups. And boy, unfortunately, this next one, owners waited and waited for this player to return, Ross. And I didn't like his matchup last week. I actually had him as a sit. And now he's got another negative matchup this week. Talk a little bit about the Chargers matchup with Washington.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the worst matchups you can find at the minute, unfortunately. So Perryman is definitely not a plus play. Again, you probably picked him up late in the season, so hopefully he's not crucial to your lineup. And he hasn't really lit it up either, so he's not a player I'm going to be too upset about having to bench. Hopefully you wouldn't be either.
All right, exactly. And I'll tell you, that's a situation that coming into the season, Ross, and that's why I love doing this, and the fact that every season is an entity to itself. I remember before the season we were talking up Denzel Perryman, obviously before the injury, Jatavis Brown. And that, to me, I thought he was like a budding star, especially a budding IDP star. And now, both of these guys are off the radar. And as we said, Perryman can be sat this week. Brown has lost snaps all year long and is really irrelevant. And boy, speaking of irrelevant, my Detroit Lions are quickly becoming that. Thank you very much. And to add insult to injury, two of my Lions make the negative matchup list this week. That's both Jared Davis and Tahir Whitehead against the Buccaneers.
Yeah, it's been not quite the season we hoped for from Davis, I guess. I mean, it's something we talked a little bit about last week, but again, still hasn't had a double-digit tackle game, and I'm not sure he's going to get one against Tampa Bay. I'd love to be proved wrong. Tahir Whitehead has probably been the guy of the two you'd rather have over recent weeks, but I'm not sure, again, if you're going to want to plug him and play him at this stage of the season in such a negative matchup.
Right, and somebody on Twitter reached out to me about these two players, I guess, because I live in Detroit and they listen to the show and they know. And I'll tell you right now, I'm staying away from both of them just for the fact on a weekly basis you can't tell what's going to happen. Whitehead had a great game 2 weeks ago. Then you look at last week, and which wasn't a bad matchup. Again, we've talked about the Ravens are a good matchup for linebackers. He finishes with 4 total tackles on 64 snaps. And to flip the script a little bit, Jared Davis ends up with 8 total tackles playing only 51 snaps. It's one of those situations that gives me a headache, not only as a Lions fan, but as an IDP owner. So for me, that you just I'm just pushing those guys to the side, especially in the fantasy playoffs. I don't need that aggravation. And speaking of aggravating, it's probably going to be an aggravating day for a couple of New Orleans Saints linebackers in a matchup against the Falcons.
Yeah, AJ Klein, Craig Robertson, they're both fringe fantasy players. So if you're considering starting them this week in a deeper league, you really shouldn't. This is not the matchup to plug either and play.
Yeah, the Falcons not a good matchup for linebackers. So yeah, those are a couple of guys that you can go ahead and look elsewhere. And speaking of looking elsewhere, we're going to look at some safeties, the money men of the secondary for IDP purposes, and of course this first player. He is probably the money man, and it will probably be one of the highlights for the Dolphins in a matchup against the Patriots.
Yeah, all hail Rashard Jones, the king of fantasy safeties. Yep, he continues to put up points. I'm expecting a big week against New England, a team that traditionally allows plenty of points to safeties.
Right, I believe that Jones didn't he score a touchdown against them? I believe. I mean, they just played each other like 2 weeks ago, and I believe that was one of the highlights there. Is I think that didn't he return maybe a fumble for a touchdown or something? And while you can't count on that, you can count on tackles from Jones, but it's nice when one of the top safeties has a nice matchup. You put him in your lineup, you wait for the points to roll in. Now these next two guys again are from my Lions, and you know they have a positive matchup against the Buccaneers. A couple of players.
They do, and yeah, just to touch on Jones again, yeah, you were right. 13 total tackles and a touchdown against the Patriots last time they met. So Jones has got a high marker if he's going to beat that score, but you never know from a player of his caliber. But yeah, moving on to the next matchup. Again, as you said, Glover Quinn and Miles Kilbrew are the two I'm cluing in on for the Lions. But Kilbrew's one I was a little bit shaky on recommending because his snap count wasn't as high as I was hoping for last week, and I thought I'd actually pick your brain a little bit, Wally, and see if you had any thoughts on if there was an alternative safety to look for in Detroit this week.
I was just about to mention that because as you mentioned Killebrew, I remember thinking while watching the game, he wasn't out there nearly as much as I thought it would. I thought they would use him in a linebacker situation. I think they actually used Reeves Maben more at linebacker than they had previously. And if you look, I think Killebrew played 7 snaps. And I looked to see, well, then who else was playing, strong safety, and checking out the excellent the stats and info that we have at Pro Football Focus, and there really isn't anyone. That would be
Exactly.
I would probably avoid Killebrew. I mean, which me saying that means that he'll play 60 snaps and have 15 tackles. But no, it was strange. Or maybe they'll have learned from that mistake, or maybe they were using another linebacker because, as we mentioned earlier, Baltimore, linebackers do well against them. Obviously that's for fantasy purposes. I'm sure defensive coordinators see that. Well, let's get some linebackers in there to stop that run. But no, Killebrew's he's a little iffy just again because I don't know what they're doing.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that was the issue I had when trying to work out what had happened. I wondered if it was just a scheme thing, the way the defense was being called all game to maybe shut something in particular down. So again, that's if I was, so Glover Quinn is the main guy we're looking at here in this matchup, but Killebrew, as you say, there's a big question mark over exactly what they're going to do with his playing time, but he would be the other guy if I was going to choose anyone in that secondary.
All right. Well, in this next player, unless he, we'll touch on him quickly here, but unless he wins his appeal, he's going to miss out on this positive matchup against the Bears, and that's George Iloka of the Bengals, who's right now suspended.
Yeah, I saw that just as we came on air. Yeah, he's picked up a 1-game suspension for his big hit on helmet to helmet on Antonio Brown. So I had a quick look at the snap count. Josh Shaw played 41 snaps last week because obviously Ioka plays free safety. They've had issues at the strong safety position as well, and Josh Shaw was the snap leader at strong safety last week for them. Bearing in mind that Ioka's missing as well, I think Shaw is probably the guy you want to own if you're going to pick up a Bengals safety. I'm saying that with what sounds like not much confidence because I'm not sure. I'm not sure how in a big week like this in fantasy football whether I'd roll the dice this big. It's a good matchup, but yeah, Josh Shaw's a little bit too unknown for me.
Right, yeah, that's again maybe one of those swing for the fences things. I got about a minute and a half to go here. We got a few more negative matchups now to talk about, and it's a couple of your LA Rams that
Philadelphia.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Philadelphia have been a tough matchup, one of the worst matchups all year for safeties. So, if you're someone who's looking at John Johnson or LaMarcus Joyner, again, that kind of fringe fantasy players, DB3s, who you may start in a deeper league, you might want to think twice. Carson Wentz has been pretty safe with the football this year.
Right. And while we like the linebackers against the Baltimore Ravens, we're not crazy about the safeties.
Exactly, and that's been part of the problem. The linebackers are munching up all the points. So Sean Davis is a player you want to be careful of this week.
Right, and we'll take it on home with a couple of you might look at the matchup and say, "Oh, this is an easy game for the Packers as they head to Cleveland, the winless Browns," but it's not an easy matchup for a couple of safeties there.
No, it's not. Yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about Jabril Peppers being out, so we're expecting Derek Kindred is potentially going to be the guy you'll be starting there in Cleveland, but he's not really a fantasy asset, so I think you've got to definitely think twice about putting him in your team.
Right, and so there you have it, the matchups that can help you get, not that can help you get, that will help you get to your fantasy football playoff second round. I hope you were jotting down some notes. Ross is hitting the nail on the head like he always does, and now Ross is going to take us home until next week as he always does.
Thanks very much, Wally, and as always, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully there'll be plenty of you tuning in again next week. Most of you will be through to the next round of the playoffs, so until then, adios amigos.